All right, so the next method that we're going to check out is using watercolor. So a couple notes about the watercolor palette that I'm using. These are artist grade watercolors. They are the ones where you take them out of the tube and put them into a palette, as opposed to some watercolor palettes that a lot of students might have if you're a student studying printmaking. They're sort of the pre-made palettes. These have a nice high pigmentation. They'll work a little bit better for this method than, let's say, a Prang watercolor palette or something that might be more like K through 12 school grade. So just something to keep in mind if you want to try the watercolor method. I'm not saying it won't work with a cheaper version of watercolors, but you may face a little bit more difficulty. You might not get the same pigmentation quality, those sorts of things. So again, this is all about what you have at home. You just want to take stock of what's in your art supply bin and think about how well they may or may not work with these methods and play around and have fun. Just trying to let you know what I'm working with so that you can be informed when you go into your own bin. Another thing about what I'm working with here is these could stain the surface that I'm working on. They could stain my clothes, so I'm going to be a little bit more careful about this method than I had to be with my oil pastel method, which again, non-toxic oil pastels, pretty easy to clean up, pretty low risk of damaging surfaces and that sort of thing. So what you might see is my watercolor is wanting to resist the block a little bit. That could be that I still have some oil hanging out on there from previous things that I've done, but I'm just pushing my color into it, kind of rubbing it into the surface, and resisting that a little bit. I've cleaned the block a lot. I feel pretty confident about its cleanliness. I just have to sort of make my colors work. So again, where you see that happening, where I'm getting kind of that like spider situation, spider webby deal, I'm just kind of working over it and rubbing my brush into the block a bit more. One of the fun things about what we're doing here, where we're painting and drawing onto our blocks, is that we can use multiple colors really easily as we do these methods, and we can really mix colors onto the block in a different way than what we could do in a traditional setup. So of course we could do a split fountain roll, something along those lines, but here we can really pick and choose where we're applying our color. So we're gonna have a bit of fun with that, especially if we're working with a spaceman. He should be in a galaxy, so that's just science. So I'm just gonna start picking and choosing some of my favorite colors. To give him a nice, fun background. One of the things I'm doing is I'm reaching for like my darkest colors because things are gonna print lighter than what they look like on the block because of the method that we're using. So I am purposely going for what I think in my palette are some of my richest colors. So something that you want to keep in mind while you're working on your own. So the next step is we're gonna let this dry. And then when we come back, I'll show you how to print it. A couple things that I want to note. You saw me working with the Q-tip as I was going, just trying to pull up some of that extra moisture from areas where I don't want to see color on my print. I need a fresh Q-tip, but you saw in the fast-forwarded version of what I was doing that was something I was working with. You also might have saw that the ink kind of is pulling away from certain areas of the block. That is some of the, because it's such a smooth surface, the surface tension is a little bit hard to build up with the watercolor. So I'm rinsing my brushes because I don't want to mix my multiple colors I'm using together. I'm really not using a whole lot of water in my watercolor, just enough to get my paint moving and working. So I'm trying not to water down the plate too much, or water down the block too much, because there is a lot of surface tension due to this being not a paper surface, but a kind of smooth linoleum surface. If you really want to work with watercolor, you might check out sanding your block with some 400 grit sandpaper. That isn't something I explored on this block because I'm working with a couple different methods on the same block. But if you know you're going to use watercolor and you're really committed to that, that's something that you can try. It'll help, again, reduce a little bit of that surface tension. Another couple things to note when working with watercolor, you can see that because of some of the smoothness and consistencies in the block, it's not coming right up exactly to the edge the way that we ideally would have. So there's a lot of fun you can have with watercolor when we're talking about working with them on relief blocks, but it does have some caveats. So this is just something to think about. It's something to build into your aesthetic. When you're deciding what method you want to use, think about if it's okay with you to have some of these imperfections, like not necessarily being able to get your color right up to the edge that you carved, and the time that it's going to take you to build up that color on a block that has some surface tension, and those sorts of things. In my opinion, the watercolor method's a little bit trickier than some of the other ones that I'm showing you, but it's something to be explored, especially if you maybe are in a situation where all you have is watercolor. So again, we're gonna let this block dry, and then we're gonna check out printing in a couple minutes. Okay, so we have the watercolored linoleum block, and it is, okay. So we have our watercolored linoleum block, and it is dry. I did take a hair dryer at the end to speed up the process a little bit, so that's something that you might want to consider. I do want to show you a method that you can use to help touch up the block and fill in some of these inconsistencies that I talked about when I was initially applying the watercolor. So again, the watercolor method can be really interesting. It's a fun thing to explore, and if all you have is watercolor, it's something to try. But you do want to think about the surface tension and some of the imperfections that you might end up with if you're using watercolor as your method. So luckily for me, I do have some watercolor pencils available to me, and I'm going to use those to tidy up my edges. So I'm just going to stick with purple because that's what I used for the majority of this block. So anywhere that I was not able to get exactly what I wanted out of my paint application, I'm filling in with this watercolor pencil. I'm being very careful not to rub my hand in any of the places where I painted because I don't want to risk losing that information, or when I'm using this pencil, rubbing away any of the paint that I added. So do be cautious as you're using this method, but it can be very helpful in achieving some of those small details, and again, filling in anything that you might have missed during the initial stage of things. So you can see right here that watercolor pencil did start to push away some of the ink. So I just sort of fixed that inconsistency by kind of combining things. So I had put a lot of my paint on there very, very thickly. And you can see when I pushed in with the pencil, I sort of disturbed a little bit of my paint layer. So just be mindful of that. Really be cautious to just go around those areas where the ink, or not the ink, where the watercolor didn't want to sit properly, and try to fill that in with watercolor pencil. Again, if that's available to you. If it's not, then just know that you might not have the cleanliness and the crispness of your edges that you would with a different method that you might be using. So that might be something that you know when you're carving that you won't have quite those crisp, perfect edges, so you can sort of plan that into your design. Or if in the case that many of you might be in right now, you've already designed your print, you've done those steps, planning a different method of printmaking, you know, it's still something that you can kind of work with and troubleshoot with some other methods. So we've touched up the block. Now we're going to get the paper prepared so that we can print it. So what I'm going to do is I have a little water atomizer here. I'm just going to spritz my paper, trying to stay in the vicinity of where I would, where I know my block is going to happen to fall. And get nice and as damp as possible. And I am going to give it a little bit of a blot with a paper towel just to preserve the integrity of the paper a little bit. I'm bringing my registration board back from earlier. And now I have my dampened paper. I am going to line that up in the blue, which is the registration I have for my paper, and tape it down. All of this is, I'm sure, very familiar. And now we're going to put the block in. Now in this case, where we are working with wet paper, it is really important that you are using something to protect the paper where you're going to have your print from the object that you're using for transferring with, for your bear-in, or whatever you're using as your bear-in. You want to protect your paper from it. So if you have parchment paper, that is going to be really important with this method. With the last method, using the oil pastels, you may or may not need it. But if you're wetting your paper, you absolutely need to protect the paper where you're using the paper that you want your print on. So our paper is damp. It is already picking up some of that color. We have everything in register. So now I'm going to protect it with that parchment paper and go about my rubbing process the same way that I did with the previous prints. All right, I was going to just take a little peek-see, but I think that we got what we're going to get off of this one, so let's check it out. So that tore our paper. Obviously not ideal to have that happen. We are working with just basic computer paper here, so that might be something that we have to prepare for as we go. But you get the gist. It's a nice application of color. I'm really satisfied with the colors that we achieved here. There is some bleeding and issues like that that are, of course, are going to occur when we're working with watercolor, but you get the general idea of what might happen. you're going to have to be very careful, especially depending on the type of paper that you're using. If you only have, like I said, we're just using some computer printer paper. It's a delicate paper and you're wetting it down and you're rubbing on it. So you're going to have to be very careful. You'll have to plan for some things to get lost as you're working, as we always do plan to print much more than we want to turn in or much more than we want for our final edition. So keep that in mind if you're using this method. As you can see, the color saturation, it's really pretty the way that it turns out. If you like to paint, it can be a fun way to kind of incorporate your love of painting with your love of printmaking. So there's a lot of benefits to this watercolor method, but it does require a little bit more troubleshooting. We talked earlier, it's going to maybe take you a little bit longer to get those colors onto your block, and you do have to wait for the block to dry, and then working with the wet paper is going to be a little bit more delicate than being able to work directly with the dry paper. So you definitely want to have parchment or wax paper to protect your surface as you're printing, and you'll want to be aware that you might get some fuzziness, you might get some resistance from your block as you're trying to apply that color. So keep those things in mind if you're wanting to use watercolor to print your edition. And next up and last up, we're going to talk about using oil paint and you know, how we can work with an oil product without the use of a brayer. Okay, so now for our last method of options you can explore if you're doing printmaking from home and you don't have brayers and the traditional inking setup. If you're curious, when I did that watercolor block, I did clean that off camera. All I did was I used a wet paper towel and wiped the watercolor paint, what was remaining, off of the block. Very simple to clean up the watercolor method. So that's all you have to do there. Just a nice wet paper towel and clean up any color that remains. So this last method, we are going to use oil paint. It is really important to note we are using, if we're using paint, we're using oil paint or we're using watercolor. Acrylic paint is going to dry down on your block too fast to really achieve the results that you would want to achieve, especially if you're trying to get multiple prints, which I'm sure you would want to have multiple prints. Otherwise, you know, why would you be using printmaking as a method? So we are using oil paint, not acrylic here. I have a little piece of that parchment paper that I was using earlier taped down just because oil paint is, as you might expect, a little more difficult to clean up. So I can take the bulk of it and just throw it away, or if I want to, I can roll this parchment paper up and tape it off so that I can save my ink for another opportunity. But yeah, that's what I have going on there. So I'm not gonna apply much, one, because I just have a small block here, and two, this is oil paint, so a little bit does tend to go a long way. So I'm gonna set that aside. I'm just gonna use my brush to kind of spread this pigment, wake it up a little bit. I can use the brush to apply to my block to some extent, but I want to show you with the sponge. Now, you can kind of get started with the brush if that's easier for you. Kind of getting the bulk of it, getting the inner sections of your block covered. So, you know, again, I'm not being too precise. I'm just starting to get that pigment onto some of the bigger areas of my surface. And I underestimated the amount of paint that I need, so I'm going to get that back out before we continue. All right. So again, you can use a brush to initially tap on some of your color, but we're going to use the sponge so that we can get a nice, smooth, even texture. One of the benefits of working with oil paint, if that's what's available to you, it's going to have about probably the most similar effect to what we'd be using in a traditional setup. I mean, oil paint versus oil-based ink. They're not too different. So that's a nice thing about this method. But when we're talking about working from home, maybe in spaces we don't want to get too messy, those sorts of situations, oil paint is, of the three methods we talked about, going to be the most labor intensive to clean up and maybe the messiest that we're talking about. So just some things to think about as you are working. So as you can see, I have a lot of material on my block. I don't want to print it right now because there's a lot of texture there. It's really sticky. It's not going to lead to a nice, clean, precise print like what I would be hoping for. So what we're going to do is we just used that paintbrush to start the process off. We're now going to take the sponge and just kind of tap things in and smooth out that texture. This is also the time where I'm starting to work towards some of those edges that you saw me avoiding with the brush. The reason I was avoiding them with the brush is, as you can imagine, I don't want to build up too much paint on the edges of my image because I want to get a nice clean print, or at least as clean as possible. And so we don't want paint gushing over the sides of our spaceman or whatever our image might be. All right, so I've got plenty of material here. I've sort of have, as opposed to the velvety texture that we might be looking for if we're working with a brayer and we're printing in a traditional studio setup, my texture is still a little bit glossier. Now, if you're familiar with my classes, you know sometimes I say like Velcro, velvet, not Velcro. I still wouldn't say that this looks like Velcro, but it's a little glossier than what we would normally do with traditional printmaking setup. So I'm going to take a Q-tip and clean up the edges a little bit. I probably don't need it because I was pretty careful when I was working with that sponge and applying my paint, but nonetheless, just to be on the safe side, I'm going to do that before I go forward with printing. I also want to add some of the reason that this is a little glossier. It's not even just because of the application of the material, but again, this is oil paint, not ink. So there's a whole different texture that we're working with, and naturally that's going to rest on the plate a little bit differently. Or the block, I should say. It's going to rest on the block differently than our traditional printmaking ink that we would be using in class. All right, so that's pretty clean. That's ready to go. I'm going to set this aside and get my registration back out. All right, so here is our registration one last time. Here's Mr. Spaceman, and let's get started. Oh, before I put my block down, I want to set up my paper. So let me backtrack just a quick step. All right, and we're gonna print the same way we've been printing the whole time. And there we go. So I want to be mindful on my next print. I do have a little bit of transfer from some of that paint that went over the edge, so I can mask that off with masking tape. I could have taken a little bit of that oil that I talked about earlier and put that on a Q-tip to clean up some of that paint from the edges. I could also, what I would probably do is just not rub so hard in that section when I do my next print with this method. So as you can see, this is the cleanest option and probably, again, the most similar to what you would see if you were printing this in a traditional setup. You know, my only criticism on this would just be that I want to maybe try to get this smudging around the edges to reduce next time, but that's something that we always see in printmaking as a thing that we can improve upon. So again, I wouldn't use so much pressure when I'm going over that area the next time, and I would just try to be a bit cleaner with my application of my ink so that I don't have that happen. But aside from the smudging, really nice crisp edges, really saturated color we have here. So the oil paint worked out quite nicely. If you have that, great method to use. Again, if you have access to a little sponge, you can get the bulk of your paint on there with a brush and then tap it around with the sponge to even it out. And you can get an effect that's pretty similar to what you might see if you were working with a brayer. And then same sort of troubleshooting that you would do in the traditional studio setup as far as wanting to avoid some of this excess in the negative space. Just working on not using so much pressure, working on keeping the plate cleaner where you don't want to have that pigment go down. And yeah, some pretty nice results there. So that concludes what we're going to go over today as far as options you can explore printing from home. I think that it's just a matter of, these are some materials that I had handy that I was able to show you. You can take the information from this video and apply it to materials you have in your own home. And I hope what it does is it allows you to still explore the printmaking practice, even if you don't have the presses, even if you don't have the brayers, even if you don't have the traditional ink. There's a lot that you can do with you know, some pretty typical art supplies that you might have hanging around. So good luck printing, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Bye.